You're listening to Nutrition Matters Podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Hey everyone, it's Paige, your favorite nutrition podcaster and dietitian. Nutrition Matters Podcast explores what really matters in nutrition and health with a sensitive and realistic approach. This podcast relies on the support of listeners like you and needs donations to keep this project running. To help support the podcast, please consider making a donation at pagesmothersrd.com/podcast. If you find this episode interesting, engaging, or helpful in your life, please consider donating, sharing with friends and family, and leaving a review on iTunes. You can leave a review about this podcast straight from your podcast app. Search Nutrition Matters Podcast, click reviews, and then write a review. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook at Paige Smathers RD if you'd like to have a little more food for thought. Thank you for listening. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Nutrition Matters Podcast. My name is Paige Smathers and I'm your host. And you guys, I just need you to know that I have such an incredible episode to share with you today. I interviewed Claire Sheehan from the account Becoming Body Positive on Instagram, and I've been following her for a long time, and her voice is just incredible, and her following along with her on her journey and recovery is equal parts fascinating and inspiring and just beautiful. I just can't say enough positive things about my friend Claire. So I'm so excited to share with you this episode that we sat down together and talked about her story. Before we get into that, I just want to mention a few things. If you're looking to kind of take healing your relationship with food to the next level, if you like what we talk about on the podcast, if this stuff resonates, but you're looking for kind of more guidance in how to make it happen in real life, I'd really encourage you to check out my online course. You can find that on my website, pagesmothersrd.com/course, and just see if it might be a good fit for you. I'd also encourage you to join us in the Facebook group where we talk about specific episodes or people reach out with discussion questions, and it's a supportive community full of people who listen to the podcast. So join us there. That's Nutrition Matters Podcast Community on Facebook. And then I just always love to really show appreciation for all of you who are willing to leave a review for me on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. It means a lot, and it helps me continue to do this work. It helps more people find the show, and it helps me, like I've mentioned this a lot on the podcast, but it just really helps me in so many ways to continue to be able to do this. So thank you so much. For those of you who have done it, and for those of you who haven't, I would strongly encourage you to take a few minutes just to do that for me. That would be really appreciated. So, one other thing, if you are up for an all-day workshop, I would encourage you to check out my mindful eating workshop that I'm putting on in the spring in Salt Lake City. I am so excited to put this on with my friend Noah Rasheta. This is an all-day workshop. We're going to talk through the main principles of mindfulness, and kind of relate it to how to approach food and our bodies in a whole new way that helps us take great care of them and feel good, and avoid the pitfalls of dieting. So if you're interested in that, if that intrigues you, you can check out episode 100 where I talk with Noah more about what we're planning and what we're doing with the workshop. Also, if you're wanting to sign up, the website is mindfuleatingworkshop.com, and we'd really love to see you there. So with all of that being said, I'm so excited to bring you this episode with Claire. I just ended recording this just feeling on cloud nine. She's awesome. She's amazing. So inspiring. And I know you're going to get a ton out of this episode. So enjoy it. And thanks again for being here. Hi, Claire. Welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast.
Hi, Paige. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Claire, I have been looking forward to this for what seems like forever. I mean, I'm really serious. Like, I get excited about pretty much every podcast episode, but this one, I mean, I'm just pumped. So thanks for being here.
I've actually had like a Google alert on my calendar for this for like over a month. And like every week it will remind me of like a countdown until the recording. So that's embarrassing to admit.
Oh, the feeling is mutual. That's so great. Okay. So
I've just been such a long time listener. So it's very exciting.
Well, and Claire, just for anybody who doesn't already know her, she does amazing stuff on Instagram, and I love following your work. I love listening to and watching your stories, and kind of like I feel like I get to kind of journey through your process in recovery and also just kind of like in life, which is so much fun. And you really let people into kind of what you're thinking about, what's going on for you. And I love it because, like, I don't know, it's not this like curated, like, oh, I'm just gonna, take fancy pictures in front of my window, like account. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, I'm really about to go to bed and my hair is crazy. And
that sounds familiar.
I mean, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, I love it. Like, I just love the authenticity, and I think you're amazing. And you have so many like incredible points that you make about this idea of recovery. And so I can't wait to chat with you about it.
Yeah, it's been a wild year. I've had the account for, I guess, a little over a year. But yeah, it's turned into just, I mean, I guess most people with any sort of account would probably relate to this, but just my favorite kind of outlet, just because it kind of is just like an ongoing stream of consciousness of my thoughts throughout the day. So it's just a lovely touch point, as I kind of, my account for anyone who doesn't know is basically kind of a crash course in my process through eating disorder recovery, and kind of immersion into body politics, and the body positivity movement, over the past 12 months or so. And so I think it's pretty normal that, usually we go through the day having all these mind grenades that go off as we keep learning about this stuff and having our eyes open. And so it's been cool just to kind of have a place where I can hop on and be like, hey guys, this really bothers me and we have to talk about it.
I love it.
So
and do you get like supportive feedback from people, or do you get pushback, or what's it like?
Yeah. I mean, I think anyone who is kind of involved in the body positive movement or anything sort of revolving around body politics, particularly people who don't necessarily live in conventional bodies and show them on the internet, will get a good amount of trolling. I'm certainly not immune to the trolling situation, which can be a little brutal at times. But I mean, with those types of things, I don't engage with that kind of behavior. So I've kind of definitely gotten to the point where I'm desensitized to it. For the most part, I would say, the best thing about it is kind of the community building, and obviously the friendships and connections that you make just from the kind of bond of shared experience, which is really cool. I will say, though, the really cool thing is the people who will message with the intention of really starting and getting into a conversation. Some people call that call out culture. For example, like if I screw something up and say something that is not super correct or isn't super well thought out. But I have formed really wonderful relationships with people who are just really committed to not, kind of nailing anyone to the cross for making a mistake, but just kind of being like, hey, like you mentioned this, and I think that there's kind of more thinking that we should do here, or have you ever thought about it from this perspective? And so it becomes this kind of amazing ongoing dialogue that takes place that is just, it sounds really cliche, but there's like a stream of constant learning. But it's really cool. It's certainly made me much smarter, which is always a good thing. So it's very interesting for sure.
Well, I think you do such a great job, and I always learn so much every time I check out your account or listen or watch one of your stories or whatever. So great job. It's so fun. And it's so fun, again, to just be sitting down and chatting with you today. So, so we wanted to sort of, well, actually, before we get into that, talk about like who you are and what you do, just to kind of get to know you a little bit. Because a lot of times on the podcast, I interview, other clinicians in the field. So talk about what you do, like for your day job and stuff, so that people can understand where you're coming from. My
weird double life. Yeah, my alternate life. It can feel that way sometimes. It's definitely bizarre. So I'm Claire. I just turned 26 a couple weeks ago. So I guess I'm no longer like a kid. I'm like finally a real adult.
You're like a full-blown grown-up. I keep saying that to myself.
Weird.
Like the other day I bought a vacuum and it was really exciting to me. And I was like, wow, I've officially entered into like the grown-up phase. Anyway.
Yeah, I was one of those weird kids that was like super into like very adult interior design from a young age. Not that I could afford any of it, but I always subscribed like to the online version of Architectural Digest and was always obsessed with that kind of stuff. So I'm with you.
Okay.
Anyway, Claire, 26. I'm a born and raised New Yorker. I grew up in Brooklyn for like the first 8-ish years of my life. Then did a bunch of moves around, eventually ended back up in Manhattan where I went to high school. Kind of a fun fact about me, I actually did my undergraduate and graduate education in the UK. So I was over there for about 5 years.
I didn't know that about you.
Yeah. Cool. So I was over there for a while until, let's see, when did I move back? I guess I was about 23, something there. And then came back to New York for a bit and then did a brief 2-year hiatus down in DC and then just moved back up to New York a couple months ago. So we kind of came full circle there, but I'm back to my roots.
Back to your roots. And do you live in Brooklyn?
I do not live in Brooklyn. I'm currently in Manhattan. I am in the process of applying to take the leap to go back to school next year for my PhD. So I'm actually at home right now, which just shout out to anyone who's 26 and at home. But it just sort of made sense in the sense of, saving for tuition and things like that.
For sure. Yeah.
I was going to be home for under a year. So it was sort of like, Manhattan rent prices are insane. So
insane.
It's been a challenge, but
I bet that's not easy.
Was the smart choice. Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of the brief crash course, at least in the logistics part of my life.
Cool. Yeah. And we'll get into more of the non-logistics part.
Yes.
Okay. So we want to center our conversation around this idea of becoming body positive. That's your Instagram handle. And before we started recording, you kind of mentioned that you wanted to sort of talk about the idea of kind of the authority piece of talking about body positivity as if both you and I have this all figured out, or as if we have, any authority with this. And we both mentioned the importance of just saying, we really want to stress that this idea that we're going to be discussing today is in the spirit of trying to help people discover their own authority with body positivity and with life and with self-care and with self-love in general. So I think that that's really important stuff to say up front. What else would you want to add just to kind of make sure that we're being sensitive, talking about a topic that is more than just, about our bodies. It's about so many other things. So talk about that for a sec.
Yeah. Ooh, there's so much sort of to unpack here. So I guess I'll come at it from my own kind of personal journey with that term and that phrase and kind of how I came to understand what it means and how that's evolved, as I've kind of gone through the recovery process and gotten more heavily involved in the movement. So I will 100% cop to the fact that, a year ago and before then, I came across this phrase, body positivity. And it was still in kind of the more grassroots stages of its presence on Instagram. It certainly wasn't as big of a buzzword as it is now. And I very much confuse that term with self-love, which is very understandable because they're related. They're definitely related terms. But as I've kind of gotten more heavily involved in kind of the politics of it, it's super important to separate the two. And I didn't always understand why in the beginning, because they are so interrelated. And obviously when you hear the word body positivity, you're like, well, doesn't that just mean being positive about my body? And it took a long time and kind of a really hard kind of look at the political situation in our culture, and getting kind of a really deeper understanding of things like weight stigma, things like the different levels of marginalized oppressions in our society that have to do with race and class and socioeconomic status and ability, and sexuality, and kind of as I've been lucky enough to kind of have people educate me on those things, I've understood, whoa, I really had this kind of screwed around. So basically from where I've been able to kind of understand how the two kind of diverge is, it's basically just comes down to the fact that, body positivity and feeling positive about my own body are actually not synonymous. One is kind of the an individual's journey to improve their self-image or their self-regard, or their confidence, or their ability to kind of love themselves. But the other, body positivity, is a political movement. So it's a sort of, politicized undertaking that's happening in social justice to dismantle systems of oppression that map physical violence, emotional violence, stigma, daily kind of discriminations onto the lives of visibly marginalized people. And I think that there's been a lot of confusion about this, kind of as, the term body positivity becomes a buzzword, and you see it so frequently all over, mainstream listicles and all sorts of different media outlets, especially as it gets co-opted by brands and marketing and things like that. We've seen like the meaning of this term become diluted into just, be positive about your body, which is certainly something that is so important. Obviously, like self-love is a crucial thing, and everybody's entitled to self-love, and everybody's entitled to feeling positive about their body and loving themselves. But the conversation becomes much more political when we realize and have to acknowledge the fact that everybody is entitled to that, to have self-love, to love themselves. But, it's much harder for certain people to do that in our society, because there's a lot of people who our society says should not be doing that, should not love themselves. And so it can get very complicated very quickly. But certainly understanding that those kind of differences have been really, like, I never know how to pronounce this word, integral.
I hear it both ways.
I hear it both ways too. It's kind of like finance. People will say finance or finance, which finance. I think is crazy.
Which one's fancy? I feel like integral is fancy. Finance.
Okay, let's go with integral. It's been integral to my kind of own recovery process, and how I kind of have understood the difference between the two.
Okay, I love that distinction. I think that's really important to outline and to talk about. And when you were saying, conflating the terms body positivity with self-love, I think another, maybe something to explore here is the idea of like self-love being distinct from body positivity in all the ways you mentioned, but also perhaps on an individual level, thinking about how you aren't your body, you're more than a body. And so how self-love and body positivity are separate and distinct just from that perspective alone, I think is really powerful to separate as well, because we're more than our bodies.
Totally. I think, and this has been such a big one for me, I think like this is what I think makes, eating disorders and I mean, any sort of conversation around bodies a feminist issue, right? Because even if, let's say, like the conversation around body positivity was solely about getting women, for example, to feel good about their bodies and to feel beautiful, but the conversation then is still that women are only as much as their beauty or their ability to be beautiful or have value that's based on our beauty. Yeah.
They're relegating them to bodies still, right? Like that
100%.
What you boil down to, your worth is about your body. And I've seen that criticism from Beauty Redefined especially. Do you follow them?
I don't.
Follow
no.
their work. Oh, it's you should definitely follow them. I'm actually interviewing.
They're good. Okay, good.
Oh yeah, they're doing great. Great work. I follow them. They're actually local in Salt Lake City. It's two twins who have PhDs who look at body image resilience, and they do really, really good work. And I'm actually going to have them on the podcast soon. So yeah, and that's their whole concept is like you're more than a body. And so I think that's really, really powerful stuff to look at and to think about.
Yeah, and it's a weird thing to kind of wrap. At least it was hard for me to wrap my head around, because I think, I hope most people, I don't hope most people can relate to this, but I would anticipate that most people can, is that especially as women, we're conditioned from birth basically to believe that like our ability to be desirable and successful and valuable and worthy and all these things are always going to be in relation to how we appear to the male gaze, or just what our aesthetic appeal is in life, or that any sort of success or relationship that we have will always be better if we're more aesthetically pleasing. And so this fixation on our bodies and what they look like, it just becomes so integral to our identity, right? Like it can be so difficult once we make that realization and we're like, whoa, I can't believe I've been doing this. But then the next really hard thing becomes like, what do I do with my identity then? I don't know how to be anybody else except someone who is just obsessed with their body,
Totally.
So it's a tricky thing. But I think, sorry, I'll stop segueing.
No, please go for it.
It's just the one thing I really wanted to make. I think that kind of we talked about it a little bit offline, but the concept of, what does it mean to become body positive? And again, like that meaning to me has changed so much over the past year or 2 years. But whereas I think I would have used to approach that from becoming someone who loves themselves, I think now it just becomes this, has really nothing to do with becoming positive about our bodies, but becoming political about the concept of bodies, period. As that relates to weight, as that relates to race, as that relates to class, all these types of different intersections. So that's sort of the now way that I approach it. But anyway, that's like a lot of tangents, but
no, that's great. And was there anything else you wanted to add about just sort of the tricky space we're kind of walking in when two white women are on air talking about body positivity?
It's tricky. It's definitely tricky. I think, from my perspective, which is always going to be a privileged perspective, right? Because no matter what my body looks like or my history with weight, there are privileges that absolutely cannot be disputed in terms of my race, in terms of coming from even a lower middle class background is still a privilege, my educational privilege for sure. So there's all sorts of things that work here. And I think like when, we're talking about intersectionality, any sort of feminism, anything resembling body positivity, you get into really tricky waters when you start trying to speak with authority on something that there's absolutely no way I could ever know about, And so I think when we talk about the different intersections of body positivity or feminism, for example, and the conversation veers into intersections that I have not personally experienced. I think always really acknowledging that and understanding how the perspectives that I do have experience with might have impacted and affected somebody who is coming at a certain experience with a whole different set of intersections. It's complicated, but it should be. These conversations are never going to be easy at all. And so, but I think that's why it's so necessary to always have that, not be kind of like a side note or a footnote to a conversation. I think there's kind of common practice in talking about intersectionality where it's, the whole conversation at the end of the article, it's like, oh yeah, and intersectionality. Whereas actually intersectionality needs to be like in the first sentence, it needs to be the main focus of the conversation, because otherwise, the conversation is inherently and inevitably super exclusive. And my last point is just, I guess, I think the market of body positivity and how we talk about body positivity and just most things in general, right? Like politics, especially feminism, is so dominated by white skin discourse. It's because white people are in the position of power or in the position of privilege, we get the most representation. And so, it is something that should be questioned. The fact that, the people who are be giving the most voice to talking about this are still white skinned people, because we would never be able to speak about these issues in any sort of real way, because what the heck do we know?
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah. So, okay. So I just want to thank you for even being willing to tackle a tricky topic, even though it's definitely, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm kind of trying to honor the fact that we're trying to go there, even though we recognize that it could be a tricky thing to talk about. Do you know what I mean? And I believe that these conversations need to happen. We need to keep having them, even as imperfect as they might be, because it's all coming together and helping people hopefully make some progress individually, and also more on that what's the word? Not global, but macro level.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest takeaway for me has been, I think people now, especially, white skinned people like myself, I think there's this fear that comes with hearing the words intersectionality of I don't want to screw something up, so I don't want to talk about it. It's not my issue. But that's so wrong. It is completely our issue, because we're perpetuating a lot of the problem. And by not engaging in these conversations, and especially by not having that willingness to come to the table and be like, I really don't know it all, and I actually think I'm making a lot of mistakes, and I'll probably continue making a lot of mistakes. Unless we do that, nothing, like we won't ever be able to actually practice any sort of healthy self-criticism, which is super necessary, and understand the ways in which we're perpetuating systems of oppression, which like honestly, like we like as white people, we're doing, you know what I mean? Like we're always doing that just because it's all that we've ever known and it's what we've inherited as a race, you know? So, anyway, that's sort of my 2 cents.
No, that's, I just am grateful you're willing to talk about it, even though it's tricky. So thank you. With all of that in mind, let's talk about your story and kind of your process of struggling in some of these ways. And then and then obviously we want to focus a lot of the conversation on light bulb moments, things that clicked, things that you're actively doing that are working for you, or realizations you've made. But let's put it into context and help the listeners understand your process and your story.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Square one, day one, birth.
We're going all the way back to birth.
Well, I kind of, you know, it always starts there. Let's see. I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about, like, what was my relationship with food growing up? And it's a question that I've like thought about a lot, because just going through the process of therapy, it's obviously something that you revisit. And I think so many of us kind of, or at least me, you know, I wrote off a lot of my quote unquote issues with food or, you know, disordered relationship around food as something that didn't kind of come up until high school and college. But in kind of just being more introspective through therapy and having to talk about these things, you realize, I mean, it's all related to something, you know? And so it is kind of integral. I think I'm going to just switch back and forth between the two.
Just switch back and forth. That's just great.
Great. Integral. We'll go with integral this time. To kind of how this whole roller coaster took off for me. And before I start, I have to preface this because I already hate my answer. I am someone who has, you know, been all over the spectrum in terms of weight. But I grew up in a fat body, and I lived in a fat body until I was 22 years old. And it's really tricky. I think it's really, really tricky when we talk about people who grew up in fat bodies, and experienced childhood in fat bodies, because at least this is the mainstream narrative, is that, you know, people who grow up fat or have lived their lives fat, it's always positioned as having come out of some sort of trauma. You know, that there's this like pathologizing that goes around about fat bodies, people who grow up in fat bodies, that, you know, well, they're becoming fat had to have been, you know, they must have turned to food for some reason. You know, they must have turned to food as a way to cope through some sort of, you know, stressful, traumatic situation. And it's always made me so uneasy. And I find it just so problematic because, first of all, I think it just denies the reality of body diversity. You know, the fact that not all human beings are meant to be thin and live in thin bodies. I think it just perpetuates this idea that being fat is somehow, you know, problematic and wrong and deviant in some way. So I need to preface that because it's something that has always weighed on me in terms of how I talk about my own past and childhood and kind of my relationship with food. Because at the same time, I'm also kind of a hopeless cliche that did kind of have a screwy childhood. And I mean, you know, I'm blue collar Irish Catholic girl from Brooklyn. So there's all sorts of insanity that goes on with that little cohort. But anyway, so that's sort of my elevator pitch on the preface there. But
that's great.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for me growing up, it was me and my mom only for until I was about 8. And my mom struggles with a lot of mental illness, which at the time was undiagnosed, and has a pretty serious problem with alcohol. And so that was really prevalent in my childhood growing up. And what's super interesting is, you know, I don't really have a recollection of having a negative relationship with food until I got older, and until I kind of got socialized more into a culture where my body was constantly told that it was wrong. But, you know, what I do remember, which is so interesting to kind of have made these connections, is that for me, food was always super related to me caretaking my mom, especially in times when she was drinking or there was kind of like a episode going on with her, like a mental illness kind of flare up. and food for in between the two of us was kind of always used as a way to distract me from what was going on. So like one of a really strong memory I have is when I was younger, and my mom would pick me up from school on the way home, and she would go to the liquor store to buy booze, and there was this pizza store that was right across the street from the liquor store, and so she would take me to the pizza store, and she would order me an order of mozzarella sticks, and she would say, "Eat these, and by the time you're done, I'll be back." And so there was this routine of like, eventually as I got older, I started to understand what was going on. So there was this connection to the food, this very like fraught relationship of like, I loved this food, and this food was a distraction for me. And I knew that the food was being given to me to distract me from what was really going on. So I developed this sort of like dissociative relationship with food, I think from a really young age of, we're going to not think about what's happening or what's going to happen after these mozzarella sticks are done. But right now, like this is kind of the one, this is the 10-minute period where I can just like be happy and have this, kind of like exciting thing going on with flavor and deal with kind of real life afterward. It's interesting having made those connections to see how that's then kind of manifested throughout, the rest of my childhood. I think, food obviously was a coping mechanism, as I think it is for all humans. But I think it made, regardless of what happened with my weight, my relationship with food has always had this pathology around it, I think, because of it, because food was never kind of a way to kind of express love or even just like nourishment. It was always from this place of darkness, I think. This very emotionally heavy experience was always associated with eating.
Wow.
So
that's gotta like play a role in how you approach food, like throughout childhood
Absolutely.
and adulthood and all of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, eventually I was actually taken out of my mom's custody. It's a deep, dark story. Sorry for, for downing the mood.
No, it's great to like get an insight into your life, to be able to understand like, how all of this touched so many different aspects of your life. Food is like the basics of
so true.
Yeah.
It's so true. And I think, even just going through the therapy process, like, when I went into therapy for my eating disorder, I started off by seeing just like a specialist, a dietitian who specialized in eating disorders. And, I went with her a couple of times, and, we were going through, food journaling and feelings around food and stuff. And she was like, you're really going to have to see somebody else as well. And I was like, well, what do you mean? Like, we got it all covered here,
It's a food problem, right?
It's a food problem. And she was like, this is not a food problem.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting to see, like, these things never exist in isolation. There's always all sorts of weird stuff happening under the surface. So anyway, sort of having gone through that process, it's been so interesting to kind of open my eyes and be like, whoa, this started in a really different way than I thought,
Totally. Agree.
Yeah. So I stopped living with my mom when I was 8.5, 9, somewhere in there. Kind of bounced around with different family members for a couple of years, and eventually landed with my dad, who I lived with throughout the rest of high school, and we have a very, very close relationship. And everything kind of worked out well in terms of being able to be taken care of by him, but. Even so, growing up with him, my dad, had never raised a kid before me. He kind of just like, landed with me when I was already 10. And I not raised a kid, but let alone like a preteen girl.
That's a tough time to jump into parenthood, I'm sure.
I can only imagine. And so I think, there was this, lot of just, we're going to do the best that we can, and I think, money was tight for us, and there was all sorts of craziness between my dad and my mom, and, anyone who kind of comes from that, dysfunctional relationship household. My parents went through a pretty brutal custody battle, all sorts of court, and just all sorts of insanity going on. But, the basics get neglected, doing extracurriculars and keeping a schedule and eating at normal times of the day, those things just fall by the wayside because I think, it seems like a dramatic word, but you're trying to survive.
I was going to say that. Yeah. You're like
Totally.
in that survival mode. It's like food is kind of not high on the priority list when that stuff is going on.
100%. It's not high on the priority list. And I think, if anything, the food as coping mechanism becomes kind of very prominent, because if everything else, for lack of a better word, sucks, and food is the kind of one source of joy, which I think is something that, in my dad's own relationship with food, he's kind of always had that relationship with food too, where, at the end of the day, if you spend a whole day hustling to pay the bills and dealing with all sorts of craziness with your kid and the family and everything, like, to be able to come home and have like a really delicious meal and just kind of dissociate for a few hours is very powerful and very, at least at the time, it feels very healing. And so I definitely think that there was a lot of that going on. But something that has really kind of helped me kind of reframe that experience has, because for a long time I held a lot of resentment. I was very like, why wasn't I taught how to quote unquote eat normally? And if only, I hadn't grown up in this situation, I would have, quote unquote, been in a normal body, and I wouldn't have had the experience that I had growing up, with my experience with weight stigma and all that sorts of stuff. But it was actually Isabel Foxen-Duke. If any listeners are not familiar with her work, she does really incredible work in the intuitive eating space, and she's just a really great advocate for eradicating fat phobia. And she was kind of the first person I really found in the food space in my early recovery days. But she does a lot of work around how we reconceptualize the concept of emotional eating, and just how insanely emotional eating is demonized in our culture. It's this like incredibly problematic behavior. If you're emotionally eating, you're failing. If you're emotionally eating, you're eating wrong. And it's sort of just like really, really looked down upon to turn to food as a way to cope with emotion. And her stance, which is quite radical, comes from the fact of like, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with using food as a coping mechanism? I think the issue becomes like, we obviously want to have a diverse portfolio of how we do things. Right. Of course. And I there was a long time where I didn't. Right. But when people are using something as a coping mechanism, they're doing the best thing that they have available to them in the moment to get them through the next day. And so understanding that and being like, wow, like in many ways, that was actually a really powerful way for both me and my father to self-care through a really tough time in our lives. And so thinking about it through that lens has really helped me kind of evolve my thinking about the whole thing.
And just a quick word about emotional eating. I think people get really tripped up when they try to like eradicate it completely, when they're like, oh, emotional eating is terrible. It's pathologized. Right. And then obviously you're going to run into a moment of your life where you're eating for emotional reasons. And then what does that set you up for? Feeling like you're failing, feeling all kinds of guilt and shame about that, when in reality, like it's one of like you said, like it's one of the many options we have to get through a difficult time. And if the goal is to completely eradicate, you're going to set yourself up for feeling like probably honestly perpetuating it. And if you're able to kind of recognize that like that's just one of those things that happens here and there and it's not a huge deal, it's more likely to be not really a problem. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes total sense. I mean, I think it just comes down to like, you don't want to get in a situation when you're on the don't emotionally eat diet, which is just you're on another diet where like if you emotionally eat, then you're off the wagon.
And if you really think about it, it's like you could call any eating experience emotional because eating does bring up emotions. It brings up nostalgia. It brings up, comfort and pleasure and enjoyment and all. I mean, if you really like question, what does that even mean? It starts to kind of unravel in terms of making a bunch of sense, So
I love that. I mean, food is 100% emotional. Anytime that you're eating, there's emotion involved, like food it's just so much a part of the human experience. I reject this kind of like food is only fuel, because
I hate that. I hate that.
I hate that too. Because I think even people who approach food from that perspective, they're not realizing that they're still approaching food from a deeply emotional place. It's just not a very happy emotional place.
So true. That's still emotional, right? Yeah.
Totally.
And sure, I will give a little caveat here because I've had clients who are like, all throughout their day, they're feeling all kinds of different emotions and they literally go and eat something every single time they're feeling anything. And it's like, it becomes a bit problematic when that's your only coping mechanism. But yeah, like to add fuel to the fire and feel like, oh, I'm such a terrible person. I'm failing at my emotional eating diet, like you mentioned.
Right.
It's just not helpful. It's not going to like
Yeah.
help you get to where you want to be. So
100%.
Okay, so where are you in your story? You're talking about like you're living with your dad now,
Oh,
and
yes. Yeah. So, when I went to college, I think, well, I should say, I think very common for people who grow up in fat bodies. It's so rare, or at least these stories aren't told. And if there are people with these stories, then we just need to hear them. But I think the common narrative for people who grow up in larger bodies is that it's tough. It is tough because of the world that we live in. Especially when you're growing up as a kid. Kids are brutal, and so, I think there was this kind of common thread throughout my childhood, obviously, that, my body was very problematic. There was a lot of, my dad, bless his heart, I think, it's just the really troubling thing about parents who grow up, obviously, in a different generation and have a very different understanding of weight and weight loss and all this kind of stuff. My dad comes from a military background. And so there was, this regime when I was growing up of, go run around the block every day. And, there was this like constant policing, I think, of my behavior to try and make me fit, and trying to get me to lose the weight. And I think that was just like a constant thread throughout my childhood because, I have a lot of empathy for this perspective because I think parents, they don't want their kids to have a hard time, but I think, actually, I think it's inherent with all of us. I think we want to lose weight. We quote unquote don't want to be fat because we know what that does. We live in a world riddled, drenched in weight stigma. It is significantly more difficult for people in larger bodies to move through this world and have relationships and pursue certain career paths and do basic things because of this incredible stigma around weight. And so, that was something I really internalized from an incredibly young age. And I kind of grew up, my identity kind of really became centered around this idea of like, one day I'll lose the weight. And, my identity evolves into this, constant fantasy of who I would be once I did lose the weight. I went into every summer kind of being like, okay, this summer is the summer when it's finally going to happen. And I'm going to do the dieting and I'm going to come back, the butterfly and, come out of the cage and all these sorts of things. And it's a really, really damaging narrative, especially I think for children to go through because Virgie Tovar talks about this and she just said it so beautifully. I'm probably going to butcher and in my paraphrasing of what exactly she says, but people who grow up in larger bodies, they grow up with this like inability to fully realize themselves as like living, breathing, completely whole human beings because of the way that the culture puts us on this path to who we'll be and who we'll become and what we'll be able to achieve once we lose the weight. There's no ever time spent actually digging deep into like figuring out who we are.
Right now,
it's always like
here in this
right
moment.
now. Absolutely correct. It's always like who will be when. And so you kind of live your life kind of anchored around this future state as opposed to who you currently are.
And then it's really stunts your ability to grow and to develop because you're constantly like living in the future, like you're not really doing the work that you need to be doing here and now to be who you want. And I'm not talking about weight. I'm just talking about the person you want to be.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think the word that really always sticks out for me whenever I get into conversations about this is codependency, which is a word that I only ever really knew in relationship to AA, to Alcoholics Anonymous, because it's a word that's really commonly used with addicts in terms of, people who are in families with addicts or people who are in relationships with people with addicts. It's always like this, position as like this enabling behavior that will enable addicts to continue to use whatever substance. But as I've like learned throughout the therapy process is that it's of course it's related to that, but codependency is actually like this really deep underworld of bizarre kind of dysfunctional emotional behavior. It's been so interesting applying that to my experience kind of growing up in a larger body where hypervigilance is a really big part of, I think, the experience where you learn and internalize from a really young age that, you're not going to be received well, or that there's always this threat, this looming threat that you'll be rejected or commented on or judged. And so you become very adept at constantly anticipating that and learning these codependent behaviors of molding yourself to social situations so that you can get out unscathed.
So the research supports the research about weight stigma supports that and talks about how like that hypervigilance you're talking about is this response to knowing what people are thinking about your body or saying about your body or judging you for, and how that puts you into like this chronic kind of like fight or flight state, which is really adaptive in an acute state of threat. When it's chronically happening in your body over and over again, day after day, due to this subtle and also really obvious weight stigma that you're experiencing, that can actually, like the research, I'll just quote it because I have it right here in front of me.
Oh yeah.
But they talk about how this obviously like increases the stress response, which is activated in response to social threat and can lead to cortisol secretion and stress-induced eating, which detrimentally affects metabolic and cardiovascular system functioning. So, I mean, if people haven't gotten into the research about weight stigma, like it's fascinating stuff that's like literally cutting edge happening right now. There are so many people looking at the effects of exactly what you're talking about on our health, on our psychological health, on our overall well-being and our ability to connect to each other. And I'll tell you what, like Instagram and social media and all the comparisons and all the anxiety associated with that is like not helping,
Oh, it's definitely not helping. I mean,
although you're helping.
Well, so are you, but I think that is like the most eye-opening part of learning more about weight stigma is obviously, I think it's easy enough to make the leap in terms of how weight stigma would affect us psychologically. But I think that the big, huge kind of eureka moment for me was understanding how much my physical health was jeopardized through the weight stigma, and in general, how much larger bodies are physically put at risk by weight stigma. And it's that constant release of cortisol. I mean, these are real physical processes that happen in the body where when you're constantly in that fight or flight, state of being, and your adrenaline is constantly coursing through your veins, it takes an incredible amount of toll and stress on your heart and your blood pressure. And so, these things impacted over time, 10, 20, 30, 50 years, these things do shorten the lifespan. Absolutely. There's no way that you could argue that they don't.
There is total like research to back up what you're saying. I mean, there's increased mortality risk associated with weight stigma. And it's something we need to be talking about, something we need to be looking at. And I think, your story really highlights one example of what it can feel like to be in this place where that you are being stigmatized, Yeah,
I mean, and I think, and then kind of just drawing the line over to the emotional side of things, I think when you are in a state where you feel like in every single social situation or interaction that you have, you're constantly having to compensate in some way for your size or get people to look beyond that size and anticipating all sorts of situations to figure out the best way to do that. You kind of lose any sort of way to be a full human being because you don't have needs. You don't have the ability to assert yourself. You don't have a voice, right? Because you're always kind of molding that in terms of what you're anticipating other people will want so that you can be needed. Because I think the constant fear is that you won't be. And so you kind of, or at least this was my experience, you kind of just live to serve the emotional needs of others so that, at least again, for me, that was the way that I was able to derive the most value because I just assumed for so long that there was no way that I would ever be able to achieve any sort of value just by being there, because that was just what I internalized.
Well, first of all, that's so sad. But second of all, like, did you feel like just being like your physical presence in a room made other people uncomfortable? Like, does that resonate?
Yeah, I mean, it's yes and no. It obviously depends on the situation. I think, I think it very much depends on the culture that you grow up in. And I think that this is where it really starts to intersect in terms of race, but especially class. So this is sort of relates to my story a little bit. When I moved in with my dad, I wound up getting a full scholarship to a really fancy all girls private school in Manhattan. And it was this very, very bizarre kind of shell shocking experience where, I grew up, very poor. My family, we don't come from money. And I, went to public school just like normal kids, and did not grow up, with any sort of access to wealth. And then I was kind of plopped in one day, to this very elite private school for people who came from, wealth like I could have never imagined,
Wow, yeah, I can't imagine.
And it was very strange, especially as a young kid. But, the expectation and the cultural kind of, precedent around body size, especially what women should look like, was very heavy there. And so there was absolutely, I think, this impression of being, this is a horrible word, but it's just one that I really identified with, of being like the eyesore of my class, because there's just a real investment, I think, of, being wealthy and having status is very much in relation to aesthetic and what we look like. And a lot of people who I think grow up from those backgrounds, that's impressed upon them for a very young age, to be rich but not look rich, is, I think, a really big part of class war and class struggle. And it's super interesting historically, right? Because 500 years ago, bigger bodies were prized, right, because of the economic situation. So, when there was limited food access, before capitalism, having a ton of access to food was only something that the wealthy were able to do. And so being in a bigger body was a marker of social status. Whereas now, when food is so ubiquitous, the ability to be thin is more of a rarity. And so I think, anyway, it's always really fascinating.
It is fascinating.
I think rarity is so interesting.
And some of the feedback I get about that too, like you mentioned, the idea and the intersection of class. I also get feedback when I do these types of trainings and talks with one of my local. There's a local organization that helps folks who are of lower economic status in the area, kind of with helping to provide some early intervention programs. Anyway, so the other day I was talking about weight stigma with them, and we were talking about nutrition and stuff like that. And some of the feedback I got was, well, in my culture, it's good to be fat, and we compliment each other for that, or we joke around about it and we praise that. So in some ways it's tricky to talk about this because different cultures might see these issues very differently. And also, but it's interesting because the research also shows us that the more a culture becomes westernized, the more likely they are to struggle with these very same things that we're talking about. So I love the idea of cultures celebrating, beautiful, diverse, biological diverse bodies. But I also unfortunately know that doesn't always translate to lasting once someone's kind of been more a culture. What's the word? A cult.
Oh, like acclimatized?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Acclimated to the new culture. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's like a key point when race really enters the conversation, is because when we talk about the westernization of culture or people being westernized, Western culture is a white culture, and so I think, I think it would be hard pressed to say that, well, maybe in this country, and this, people can definitely feel free to call me out on this. I think, we're all kind of touched by the thin ideal nowadays. I think that is so prevalent, but I think, the thin ideal is essentially rooted in whiteness.
Right.
This is a white concept that was then, marketed and commodified out worldwide. And so they're all related. These things are, whiteness is a powerful construct. And so I think thinness is very much a part of that construct. And when, the Western culture, which is a white culture, is seen as the most powerful, people see, having to be westernized or move to the West in order to, have access to money or to be successful, things like that. Thinness becomes part of the package deal. Achieving thinness is a way to elevate your social status, to achieve more social mobility, which was a really interesting one for me growing up, especially because there was always this tension, especially when I did go to this fancy school. We still didn't come from money, and so there was always this tension of imposter syndrome. But I think of wanting to appear like you fit in, and so thinness becomes a big part of that, because I couldn't have people come over to my house because they would know that I wasn't as rich as them. And that was really important to a lot of the people that I went to school with. But to the extent that I would be able to look like them, I could pass, for someone of a higher social class. And I think that was something that I really internalized from a young age as well. And I think that really did interplay with the eventual onset of my eating disorder. So it's just, yeah, we could talk about this for days.
It's
so
fascinating. It really is. So talk about high school. It sounded like you were kind of dealing with being in this different environment that you weren't used to, that you weren't very comfortable with. But it sounds like you didn't really develop issues around food, so to speak, until later on. Is that right?
Well, I didn't. Well, what's really interesting is I was going to say I didn't develop restrictive behaviors around food until later. But to be honest, I think there was always restrictive behavior going on. I think, from when I basically started at this school, there was always this pendulum swing of, when I was at school, I wanted to eat like everybody else, and eating disorders were really rampant at my school. And so there was a lot of restriction going on from a very, very young age. And so I wanted to eat like them because I wanted to look like them, and I wanted to fit in.
Yeah.
So, I remember, never eating breakfast and, going to school and kind of eating as little as possible to kind of show the other girls that I was like them, and give them less reason to kind of question me or to stand out. And what's really interesting there is that behavior was also very much rewarded. There's a lot of talk, I guess, in fat positivity circles around kind of rejecting the pressure put on people in larger bodies to be the quote unquote good fatty of the person in a larger body who, it's constantly has to prove to the world that they exercise, that they eat really healthy and they eat really balanced. As kind of to compensate for the fact that their size, or the undertone is well, I'm working on it, which is horrible. But I definitely did that when I was a kid because it just felt like the best way to kind of manage my situation. But so I was restricting all day basically, and then I would go home and obviously consume copious quantities of food, partially because I was starving, but also just from the stress. So it was very cyclical in that way. Okay. I think. And because I never had a good baseline of what feeding myself adequately looked like, because I was never really taught how to feed myself adequately, I never knew that there was a middle ground. I always only knew the two very polar extremes. There was no really kind of neutral day for me. It was always kind of in this polar opposites realm. But I would say that, and that basically continued through college as well, until I kind of reached this point in my senior year of college where, I think I walked around with this dream in my mind and my heart that, if I could just stop time, if I could just pause the world for a year, I could stick myself in a box and just diet and quote unquote get rid of this problem. And I was never able to do it before because, I had to go to school and, I wanted to get good grades or, there was just too many distractions. And so, I think I reached this point. I was 22 and it was really difficult, I think, being in college and watching people have all these kind of adult experiences like relationships and sex and all these things that, as a 22-year-old, I wanted to experience. You think you experience a ton of anyone who's experienced unrequited love. It's horrible, but having to, and everybody goes through that to some extent. But I think in my mind, I just had internalized the idea so much that I wasn't experiencing these things because of my body. And I was just so tired of it. I just wanted to know what it was like on the other side. And so I did a year of grad school, the year following when I graduated from undergrad. And I went into it knowing I was like, this is the year that I'm going to do it. And it was kind of the quote unquote perfect situation. I went to grad school in a city where I didn't really know anyone. So I knew I would be alone and, it was kind of the perfect amount of time. It was a year. And so I went and that's what I did. I mean, I don't know what it was necessarily in my brain. I think it was just the cumulative effect of weight stigma, to be honest. And just this unbelievably strong will to want to escape that reality. That kind of just put me into tunnel vision mode. And I wasn't being supervised by anyone. So I was very much able to do it. And I think, as anyone who's ever kind of been on the diet roller coaster knows, the first real diet that you go on and you start to see that weight loss, and most people will see pretty significant weight loss for their first diet, right? Because your body's in shock. So I dropped a lot of weight very quickly. And I think that was incredibly intoxicating at the time to feel like it's working, obviously not knowing anything that I know about the reality of dieting that I know now. But that kind of intoxication was enough to kind of keep me through. And the kind of shell shockness that my body was in enabled me to do some really kind of dangerous behaviors for a prolonged period of time, because I didn't catch up to me until later.
Yeah. So you're at grad school, you're kind of doing your own thing. Did you know that you were developing somewhat of like a problem, or did you feel like, oh, this is great, I'm getting all this feedback, I'm sure because I know how this story goes, like,
right,
people were commenting. I mean, you felt like you were on top of the world. And to someone listening who's like new to this world, I'm always sensitive to people who might be like, what are they talking about? Like, how is this not like a glorious thing? Like, how are they talking about this in terms of like, this wasn't a good thing for her? Because I have listeners of all walks of life who might just find this episode first before they've listened to anything else. Talk about talk about all of that.
Yeah. So for me, I had kind of set it up as, I watched a lot of movies growing up because I wasn't very social. So I have this kind of like bizarre cinematic part of my brain, which works for me and against me, but it makes me kind of live in somewhat of a delusion sometimes. But I had always, because I went to college in the UK, there was always this routine of when I would fly back to the US for summers, there was always this dream that I had and this like kind of like cinematic montage going where like I would get off the plane and nobody would be able to recognize me, like waiting for me at arrival. So I would like walk right past them and they wouldn't even know it was me.
So dramatic.
Right. The big reveal, so I was very, very attached to this idea. And so, it was this perfect thing where I was like, well, I'll come back after a year and that will happen. And so, while I was there, I was in London, was the city that I was in. And, like I said, I didn't really have any like real friends while I was there. I had a couple friends from college, but I actually didn't. I received some comments while I was there, but like I wasn't really being seen. I mean, I really am not kidding when I really went into like isolation for a year. But on the physical side of things, it was definitely in that year when I knew that something was wrong with my body, but I could not make the association that it was because of my eating behavior. Partially because I had grown up in a quote unquote clinically obese body and had always been told by doctors, that my condition was quote unquote life threatening. And, I had to lose weight at all costs every single time I would go to the doctor, which I didn't go in that year, but, it was just encouraged. I was doing the right thing, so there was no way that what I was doing was wrong. But I remember very vividly during that year, I developed really crippling insomnia. That was really, really bad.
Oh, that is so awful.
It was awful. And I had no idea that it was because I was starving, I mean, I had no idea that could even happen, so there was an issue with that. And obviously when you're tired, you're in an emotional wreck. And so I was crazy. It was a lunatic, but I lost my period as well. And what's so interesting is that, I grew up around so many people who struggled with anorexia, who were losing their periods left and right, but I never made that connection with me. I was like, I must not be eating enough iron. Like I literally convinced myself of this. I was like, there's no way that I'm anorexic because I'm still way above in the quote unquote overweight category for my BMI. Like there was just no way that you would ever convince me of that.
And it probably flew under the radar if you were to go into a doctor too, because you probably physically didn't look.
Well, and so
sorry, I'm laughing just because I'm seeing your face. For anyone listening, I'm not laughing about that. Claire made this face.
You have to laugh because it's not funny, but the whole situation is so unbelievably ridiculous how much weight stigma there is in the medical field. But what's even more crazy is that when I eventually did come back to the States, and I was like the smallest that I ever had been, but I went to the doctor and I was like, I'm not getting my period. What's going on here? And at this point as well, I had started bruising a lot as well from the malnutrition. And I had no idea what that was. I was just constantly waking up with all these bruises all over my body. And I was convincing myself that I was just like being clumsy at the gym. I mean, all these things were happening that I was like, what is going on? I just couldn't make the connection. I couldn't shave my armpits. I mean, all sorts of stuff that I had no idea were even signs of anorexia. I just always thought that it was
shave your armpits thing.
So it's not everybody gets this. It's an odd symptom of malnutrition. But the skin under your armpits, sorry, this is a bit graphic, but it becomes very concave. And so it's very difficult to shave your armpits because it's just bone that's there basically.
Because
so that like space becomes like a canopy.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so I was like, where are my armpits? It's a very strange experience. It was hilarious because I was like, what's going on? But I went to the doctor and I was like, I haven't gotten my period in almost a year. And they asked me about my weight loss and I gave them the number, which was significant at that point. But again, because I had started off in an obese body, they were like, all right, like, we might want to, take up your food intake a little bit, but, and come back if it doesn't come back in a few months, but you'll be fine. Was literally what I was told. And by the same doctor given like the number of a plastic surgeon who could quote unquote fix my loose skin. So it was very much, at that point, I knew and I was scared by the fact that I didn't get my period because I didn't want to be infertile, all these types of things that happen from that prolonged over a period of time. But I was so written off by the doctor. I was like, well, all right. So like, I guess we just got to keep going. And actually at the time, when the doctor asked me about my weight loss, I said to them, I was like, I'm still trying to lose like another, X amount of pounds. And they were like, okay, great. Just don't lose another, X, number.
More
and I was more than that. And I was like, okay, great. So we're going to continue on keeping on because again, like I was never emaciated. I was never what, obviously what the media represents anorexia looks like. And in terms of BMI, I was actually still on the very low range of being quote unquote overweight for my BMI.
That is such an important thing to highlight. Like just that, your body was giving you all the signs to try to like be like, girlfriend, feed me. And,
feed me.
and it's not always this matter of like, I'm in this BMI range, so I'm fine. Or I'm in this BMI range, so I'm not fine. That's not how this works. So, we could do a whole podcast on BMI.
Yes, we could. We just need to trash that entire concept. But in these situations in particular, it just totally distorts everything in terms of how we conceive of food in our bodies and what is quote unquote normal, which is a word we also need to throw in the garbage. But for my situation, the BMI thing was really, it was medically dangerous, the misconceptualizations around it for sure.
Right. That could have some, very, very serious implications for you. So that's a scary thought to think about how much was being missed.
Yes, that is definitely true.
So when did things kind of start to turn around for you? You said that you started like 1 to 2 years ago, kind of looking at this stuff. And I'm really interested to hear about your process with that.
Yeah, I would say, I knew in my, so I finished up grad school, I came back, and the 2 years following when I was back in the States were kind of my years where I call it, in the garden of thin privilege, where I came back in the new body. And for the first time ever, I was dating and, getting all sorts of male attention. And it was really, really psychologically very disturbing time because that experience was that validation of the weight loss and that validation of all of my fears about weight were proven true. That the idea that, if I became thin, I would have the life of my dreams, for a couple years stretch there. That was kind of my experience, that society validated that, and so there was this, kind of just craziness of being there and having access to all these privileges that were just always cut off from me, particularly in terms of male attention and social life. And clothes was a huge one for me. Clothes was a really big one for me. But that being said, throughout that 2 year period, after coming out of a year and change of very heavy restriction, and obviously in a situation where I was very isolated, had very strict control over my day-to-day exercise and my food, to then come back to a situation where suddenly I was socializing and going out, I started to lose my grip on that control. And very quickly binging became part of the equation.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't able to kind of live in that isolated place anymore. And I think at that point, physically and psychologically, physically, my body was starting to rebel. There's only so much starvation the body can take before physically, and this will happen to anyone, your body will literally physically rebel against you to keep you alive. And so, I became this pendulum swing again of binging and then that crippling fear of putting weight back on. So then heavily restricting and then binging again. And so that was sort of when the cycle sort of started, and I started to be like, I can't get it together. Like, I can't get a hold on this. You know, it was really, it was just very distressing at all times, you know? And so I think as that kind of cycle intensified, I became more obsessive about food and more obsessive. You know, every single thought, every single movement was around counting, you know, around counting and tracking, and menus and food pictures. And just, you know, it was nutty. We got a little lunatic very quickly. And so there were a couple moments, you know, throughout that couple of years, I was like, okay, I would like to see someone, because why can't I get this together like everybody else who's thin has or seems to have, you know? And so I actually remember when I first moved down to DC, I made an appointment with a nutritionist who actually on the website at the time had the intuitive eating sticker. And it was the first time that I had ever heard that. And I was like, this sounds really interesting. Like, what is this about? I would love to like be able to just like eat what I want and stay thin, you know, because that was how this person had obviously perverted the intuitive eating principles, but they sold me on it at the time. And I remember sitting in this person's office, and I broke down in tears, and she was like, what's wrong? And I was like, I just feel like I don't have time for any hobbies. She was like, well, what do you mean? And I was like, well, you know, I go to work, and by the time I get home, I'm so exhausted that, you know, I don't have time to do things that I see other people doing. They're going out, they're writing, they, you know, have just all these extracurriculars going on. I just go to work and go to sleep, and I have no time for anything else. She's like, well, what time to get out of work? And I was like, you know, like 6. And she was like, so what are you doing from 6 until, you know, the 10 o'clock at night that you say that you're getting home? And I was like, well, I'm walking. And she was like, what do you mean you're walking? I was like, well, I'm walking around, because I had developed like this compulsion around exercise to always be constantly be burning off calories. That, you know, I was just always in motion. You know, I was like, well, if I'm going to be binging and eating more than I was in this year when I was in London in the den, like I'm just going to have to always be compensating by moving. And so I would spend hours walking around and racking up steps on my Fitbit. It's the whole thing. So I definitely knew something was wrong there, because I couldn't stop, you know. And I think when people would tell me, you know, to just cut down on the exercise or sit still, I was like, no, you know, I was so
well, and I think it's important to kind of like humanize this. I mean, you are humanizing it by sharing your story, but just to also like talk about how you were facing like your life as you knew it, that you'd worked so hard for, like, quote unquote.
Right.
Not that is, I don't know. You see what I'm trying to say?
I absolutely do.
Like you were desperately trying to hold on to that, and
desperately.
I mean, that totally makes sense. And it's something to like have total compassion for people in that space where it's like, all of my fears about what would happen if I got thin came true. And if I ever change body sizes, like what will happen then? Like, yeah, I mean, it's a scary place to be.
It was a really scary place to be. And I think also, you know, I don't know if everybody does this, but I think it's somewhat common. You know, when I lost such a significant amount of weight, and I had placed such a premium on this new life that I would have in the thin body, I went through a pretty significant period of erasing my past, which is quite literal. Like I remember, you know, in the kind of my last week in London before I moved back to the States, you know, I went like through all my social media and I deleted all evidence of me living in a fat body. I have like, and to this day, I have like almost no pictures of myself from childhood, you know, and growing up, and all the plays that I did, I don't have those anymore, because I got rid of them, because there was so much shame that I carried around from that. And I thought to myself at the time, you know, if I'm going to be this thin person, that's who I'm going to be. I don't want to associate with this past body because I don't want the stigma associated with it. And so it's nuts when I think about the relationships that I had particularly when I moved down to DC, and part of that move, right, was kind of going and starting over somewhere where I didn't have to have a past. I could go there and be the thin girl, and that could just be my identity. I didn't have to deal with any of the baggage from my past because no one there would know that I ever lived any differently. And so all of the relationships, the romantic relationships and the friendships that I had there, they had no idea anything to do with my past. I never talked about it, and so when I started to face this reality, this losing on the grip of my control over food, and this fear started creeping back in of, I started to put on weight, and I was like, I can't, like, I don't, if I don't have this identity, I literally won't have one because I got rid of the other one, and even when I had that one was obviously very painful. And so there was this real crisis internally that I experienced, that has taken a really, really long time to work through, of like, who am I going to be if I'm not thin?
That's a huge question. Who am I? I mean, and also like, a lot of my clients kind of express this idea of like, who am I if I'm not the girl like with an eating disorder? Or if that we attach ourselves to so many different iterations of identity in this, whether it's who am I if I'm not thin? Who am I if I'm not struggling with this? Who am I if I'm not going to therapy twice a week? And, all this stuff. So, I know that's life, right? We're trying to figure out who we are, no matter how old we are, no matter where we are in life. Like that's life. But I'm really interested to hear how you think about that question now. Like what identity, that idea of identity.
This has definitely been, I think, the biggest struggle in my own recovery process, because working through my own internalized fat phobia has been really, really emotional and very difficult, because especially when I started recovery, I just couldn't get past this thing. I think it's very common when people start recovery or any sort of like intuitive eating thing. The advice is always, well, you have to put your desire for weight loss on the back burner. If we can back burner the weight loss, then you're able to get in tune with your body more and your intuition more and have a relationship with food that's independent of weight, which makes all sorts of sense. But I could not do that. There was just no way. I was like, I knew how brutal life in a fat body could be. And
so many people in your situation and in recovery know that firsthand.
Right. Of course. Absolutely. And so it was really, and to this day, I it's not that I necessarily take issue with it, but I don't know if it's possible to separate the two because of the world that we live in. You know what I mean? And I think, the only way to really recover is if you deal with this internalized fat phobia. And the question then becomes like, how are we going to recover? How am I going to recover? How am I going to develop a quote unquote healthy relationship with food and my body in a world where, like a lot of parts of the world, like in the body that I currently have, aren't going to be okay with it, and I don't move through the world as easy as I did 3 years ago. It's certainly not, I'm not as much in a larger body as I was growing up currently, but like, who knows where my body's going to end up? I'm still in the process of recovery and relatively early in recovery, so, the big thing for me was like, with all that uncertainty, which is like the most terrifying thing about recovery in general, is the uncertainty of like, where is this going to end? What's my life going to look like, when I am, fingers crossed, recovered one day, is just kind of figuring out what life is going to look like. And it took me a really long time to kind of come to terms with the fact of like, we get involved in activism and we're actively trying to change the culture. And obviously I think that helps us develop a voice and a stronger sense of self. And those things have definitely really helped me. I mean, I can't even believe that I'm able to like public speak with you even now. I wouldn't have been able to do that a couple of years ago because I had no voice, so those things certainly help. But I think, and this is the tricky thing, because for a lot of people, I think it really does require upending a lot of our lives and a lot of the world that we live in. I had to realize that there was no way that I would be able to continue living in the social situation that I was in. I would not be able to continue dating the person that I was dating. I would not be able to continue being friends with a lot of the people that I was friends with and recover, because I created those relationships out of fat phobic mindset, and it's not to say that those people were like horrible people who were insanely fat phobic, but I just, you have to create relationships with people, and live in an environment that actually is body political, and body positive. And so it's really easier said than done.
The people you surround yourself with matter a lot.
They really do. And the thing is, like, you deserve a life where people are going to understand your recovery and value your recovery, and make sure that those things are important. And so your communities have to change. They just have to, And so I think, for a long time, I think the lingering question was, well, those people don't exist. I'm not going to be able to find those people because they don't exist in this world. And it's true that a lot fewer of them don't. It's a smaller cohort of people for sure. The majority of mainstream world is pretty fat phobic, and so it's harder, but it's growing. We're growing, and what we do exist. And I think that's the power of things like Instagram and things like that is that you have to figure it out, but it takes work. It really does. It doesn't just arrive on your doorstep. It takes a lot of active, kind of proactive, going out there and figuring it out, which is scary.
Totally scary. One of the things I just love about you is you really seem, at least from an outsider looking in, like you're really authentic and true and real about your experience, but you also seem really grounded in knowing that you're in a good place doing the right things for you. Sometimes I'll just be honest here. Sometimes some of the people that I see in these spaces kind of scream with some of the ways that they say stuff and or tactics maybe. Like, I'm struggling so much, and that's why I am like doing the things I'm doing and saying the things I'm doing. That's kind of the vibe I get from some people. I really feel from you. Like, of course you're on this journey like we all are, but you really seem like you're grounded in this, and that it's not like this, like you're coming from this place of like defensiveness. It doesn't feel like that from you. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, it's lovely to hear. I mean, I think, the way that I approach Instagram, it's been interesting, because I think I definitely relate to what you're saying about the recovery community, and kind of the like anti-diet culture community on Instagram. It can be kind of a minefield of triggers, and I think you have to be really careful, because I think also, it really depends on where people are in their recovery. And I'm very upfront. Like, I haven't been in recovery that long, you know what I mean? And like, I definitely work through all sorts of crazy stuff in therapy, but I think it's not that I don't bring those issues to Instagram. I try and really talk through things quite thoughtfully and very honestly. But I think that, when we're thinking about community, and I think of like who's receiving those messages of like, I don't think of Instagram as my own therapy. Like, I'm very, very adamant about the fact that being a part of the recovery community on Instagram is not recovery. That's not being in recovery. And I think it's a really big misconception. I think that people, they start an Instagram account or they start following a bunch of accounts and they think it's a substitute, and it's not. It's not, it's really, really not.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. And so, I try and kind of keep that. Like, I personally really value that, because I think, first of all, most, like 99% of people who have accounts, nobody's a doctor, far from it. I'm not a doctor, so I think, I think it's great that people can see things that they relate to and can say, hey, that was me too. Or like, I totally relate to that. I love that. But I think it becomes really, really bad territory when people start prescribing advice about like what to do, especially with food. And so that was always something I always tried to be very careful of. I really try not to give specific advice. I try and just share my experience and my thoughts.
Right.
It's tricky. It's gray area, but it's tricky for sure.
The reason I bring that up is I work with so many people who I'm just like, I just want them to take that leap. I want them to just like decide that they're going to look at this idea of like their own internalized weight stigma and fat phobia and like make and kind of like feel good about that. And like, okay, whatever comes with what happens to my body is worth it, because I need to do what I need to do to be in a healthy place for me. Like, it seems like you're doing that work, and it seems like you're grounded in that, and that you're not questioning that process, and hearing your whole story really makes me know how deeply rooted all of that stuff was for you. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like, how did you go from that to like this place where it's like, come what may, I'm doing what I need to do, or am I putting too much on you, I guess is what I'm.
No. I mean, I think probably, to be honest, like for the first time ever, like even in maybe only like the past couple of months, have I actually, I wouldn't say like completely grounded, because I don't want to make it sound like I'm in a better place than I actually am. But I think I've definitely reached a point where for the first time ever, I have given myself over to this process, and I've kind of embraced the uncertainty. The uncertainty, I think, has been the biggest struggle for me. But the thing is that like, this stuff takes a really long, long time. I hope that it doesn't. I hope for some people it clicks right away, but that certainly has not been my experience, and I think, I know obviously when I'm on Instagram, I talk about things, with somewhat conviction and I keep things relatively tongue in cheek, but things can be very different offline for sure.
Of course,
I think, I still really struggle with my social life and my interpersonal relationships and dating and codependency and all sorts of emotional stuff, I think though, from my perspective is, I want to be cured. I want to be recovered. I want to live this full life. I want those things, I think. And I think for the first time, I finally, even though I'm not all there yet, I'm not living, the life of my dreams right now, because I'm working through a lot of stuff, and it's slow. But I think I did reach a turning point, where I'm open to the possibility finally that having the life of my dreams doesn't necessarily have to mean that I'm doing it in a thin body, which was massive for me to get to, these are really big moments, and it doesn't mean that it's all downhill from here, obviously, or
that you don't have hard days with that.
Of course, I think everybody, because of the world that we live in, everybody will have hard days with this until they die,
Yep.
But I think that commitment to that new mindset and that commitment to, okay, slowly but surely, I'm going to start building a new life in this body, in this present body that I have right now, and practicing that presence. I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but like presence is a huge one for me because I'm so used to living according to the future state, what I'll be doing 6 months from now in this new body. And right now I'm just in the turtle shell until I can get there, So instead of, constantly running down this road of what's on the horizon, why don't we start doing things right now for today?
I think that's recovery right there.
Oof. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's the big secret.
No, I mean, that is so beautiful. And that's exactly what I was interested to hear your perspective on, was just like, how did you embrace that? And I think you answered that question so beautifully. And I know for 100% fact that what you just barely said is going to be really, really important for a lot of people, just because, like we heal each other, obviously in so many other ways, but like hearing each other's stories is so healing. And I really loved that, what you just said. It was really awesome. So thanks.
No, thank you. It's cool to talk about. I think also in terms of presence, it's been so interesting how that's affected my relationship with food as well, and helped me kind of get out of diet mentality even further. I think I had this realization a couple weeks ago in therapy where whenever I feel very compulsive around food, which for me is always at night, it's always, when, for example, like I didn't eat how I thought I was going to eat that day, or a meal doesn't go the way I planned, or I emotionally eat, God forbid, whatever it is. And then there's this compulsion to, from my inherently, my muscle memory is to binge. And it's really tricky to train the brain to do this, to, this concept of mindfulness and staying present. But when you take away the consequences of what will happen if you do X, or making up for a past behavior with something in the present, and you just focus on where you are now, like what you need, obviously like what your hunger levels are, sure, but like what your emotional state is, and you take out this like past and future, which was kind of always this like in the balance for me. There was always this like immense consequence to everything that I was doing, because everything that I was doing now was going to impact the ability to achieve the vision of later. But when you take out the vision of later, you're actually really able to make very different choices, and much more empowering choices, because you're just doing what's best for you now, as opposed to something that's going to someday achieve this vision. that is this like nebulous vision, you know?
Wow, that is such an important concept and such a good way of explaining that idea of presence, that it's being open to whatever the future is, but being in that moment where you're able to finally make choices that are like in your best interest, whether that's a cookie or a carrot, like no judgment, but just like that's a really fascinating concept.
Yeah, I used to play, I still do this, but this is like a sick game. But in the beginning of my recovery, it was the only way that I could understand this, like intellectually, was when I would, any sort of food choice that I would make throughout the day, whatever sort of meal, I would play, I call it the invisibility game, where like in my mind, if I was ever feeling stressed around food or about a decision of what to eat or when to eat or how much to eat, all these sorts of intuitive eating early days questions, I would play this game where I'd be like, well, if we lived in a world where all bodies were invisible and the issue of body manipulation, of me using food as a way to manipulate my body shape and size, were completely off the table because nobody was ever going to see me and I was never going to see anybody else, would I want this food? What choice would I be making around this food? What choice would I be making around food in general? And honestly, I'm sure there's probably something problematic with doing that, but for me, it was incredibly helpful because my choices around food were so enmeshed with manipulating my body for so long. And it's just such a part of our culture and the way that we eat is this diet restrictive mentality and the morality around food. If you eat this, you'll get X result, it'll show, you are what you eat, all this nonsense. Right. So, that was really the only way that I was able to actually get in tune with like what I really wanted as opposed to what, I thought that the food was going to give me,
Oh, we could talk a whole podcast about that one. I mean,
oh, yeah.
Starting to connect to what you actually like, what you want, can create so much clarity with food. It's really, really fascinating.
Very powerful, for sure.
So what else do you want to add? Is there anything we didn't talk about or cover?
Oh, goodness. I guess, one thing that I've been really thinking about recently is, and it seems like this is somewhat of a controversy in the recovery community, this question of like whether or not recovery is possible. And I've seen a lot of conversations around this and, there is a good contingent of people who say, because of the world that we live in, people who have eating disorders or, who grow up with this, that it's not, right? That like you are always going to be dealing with issues around food. It's never going to become easy or like you learn how to live with it, like you learn how to survive basically, but like it's not possible to escape it. And I absolutely understand why that argument is made, and I think that there's valid reasoning behind it because we live in such a disordered world, and it's hard. It's hard, and I think that is an unfortunate but an absolute truth that it's hard. But I also think it's really important to not abandon the idea that recovery is possible. And obviously I'm not someone who's on the other side, right? I can't say like I'm fully recovered. But I think it's so important to not abandon that and to hold on to the belief that it is possible to heal your relationship with food and your body and and the relationship that you have in the world. I started thinking about this. Are you familiar with Kelsey Miller at all? She writes the Anti-Diet Project for Refinery 29.
No, I don't know her.
So she's a journalist, I guess. She started this thing called the Anti-Diet Project for Refinery 29 a couple years ago. I think she started in 2014, and then she wrote a book about her experience growing up in a fat body and her experience with diet culture. And her kind of the book is about her recovery process through intuitive eating. And actually, like this past week, I think like a week or 2 weeks ago, she wrote her last installment of the Anti-Diet Project. I don't know if she's leaving Refinery 29, but she won't be doing that column anymore. And the entire last post is basically this like tribute to being recovered. And it was so refreshing to finally see someone who had gone through this process. And, obviously she's not, negating the idea, that we live in a diet culture, or that sometimes things are triggering or you have kind of, confusing thoughts, but that like she has a normal relationship with food now, and that like she's living a full life. I think that was the biggest takeaway, is that like she's living in a larger body and she's living a full life and she's an intuitive eater. And yeah, intuitive eating did not end up in weight loss for her, and who cares, because she's living a full, beautiful life. And like she, doesn't mean that like she won't have to face weight stigma in her day-to-day interactions with this crazy, unfortunate world that we live in. But like she's found a way to have this gorgeous, fulfilling existence. And it was just like, Yes, finally.
I love it.
I was crying. I was like, this is exactly what I've always needed to hear,
That hope is so important.
We need those narratives. We really do.
Yeah, I completely agree. And
especially with larger bodies, I think, and that's the really unfortunate thing about the recovery community is that most of the people who are in it are in thin bodies. A lot of people who treat eating disorders are in thin bodies, which is, not to nail them to the cross, but we need more body diversity in the space of people who are recovered to show that being recovered doesn't have a look. You know what I mean?
Or a race or a color or
a race or color, absolutely.
Or a class. 100%. Right?
100%, 100%. So I think, the more we diversify the portfolio of people who are recovered and are able to speak about it, I think that is what helps people get there because they see themselves in those people and they're like, I could be recovered in the body I have now. How groundbreaking is that?
That's so important. No, that's, you couldn't have said it better. I love it. And thanks for ending on that. That was that's such a good, hopeful note to kind of close the conversation with. And I'll look for that article and post it because maybe some people listening will want to read that same.
I'll I don't know if you do show notes, but I can.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, please do. That would be great.
Yay!
Well, Claire, thanks so much for being here. And just take a minute. People can follow you on social media. Is it just Instagram? I don't do much else because I
don't do much else because I just know that I wouldn't be able to commit, I do have Twitter and my Twitter is at @becomingbodypos. I don't think they would let me do positive because it's too long. But Instagram is where you can find me @becomingbodypositive.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks, Claire, for giving me so much of your time and for sharing your story and just these nuggets of wisdom. I cannot wait to share this episode. I know people are going to love it.
I can't wait. Thank you so much for having me. I've looked up to you for so long, so it's been a dream come true for me too.
Oh, stop.
I can keep going.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.